Everyone knows the Sumerian flood story, the man, the boat, the survival of the world. Almost no one knows the other tablet. It does not tell a story, it gives directions. Carbon dated to 2300 BC, it lists, point by point, where people were told to go when the ocean came back over the land. The instructions are not poetic, they are exact. This ridge, that cave, this height above the old shore. And the unsettling part is not that the directions exist. It is that the tablet says the survivors were not the ones who chose the places to hide. To understand what Friedrich Halm found in that basement, you have to understand what was done to it after he found it. The tablet was logged once, in his own hand, on a museum intake slip dated to the spring of 1889. After his dismissal, that slip vanished from the working ledger. The object itself did not leave the building. It was simply moved into a section of the collection that is not cross-listed in any public index, under a number that, according to two researchers who have searched for it, returns no record when queried. You cannot photograph it. You cannot request it without institutional credentials. And you cannot, they say, even confirm its catalogue entry without filing a written application that comes back unanswered. That would be a strange fate for an ordinary tablet. It is a much stranger fate for one that by every account should not exist at all. The Sumerians are the oldest civilization we can name. History places them in the marshlands between the Tigris and Euphrates around 4500 BC and credits them with the first writing, the first wheel, the first legal code, the first cities. What that history cannot comfortably explain is how all of it arrived at once. They did not develop slowly into a civilization. They appeared as one fully formed, carrying knowledge it would take the rest of humanity thousands of years to recover. They measured the lunar month to the second. They tracked the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle of nearly 26,000 years that takes generations of recorded observation to even notice. They named bodies in the sky they had no instrument to see. And they wrote it all down in a script so dense that when scholars first rediscovered it in the 19th century, they assumed it had to be the work of a far later, far more advanced people. Among the hundreds of thousands of tablets pulled from cities like Eridu, Nippur, and most record exactly what you would expect. Grain counts, debts, hymns to kings, lists of gods. A few do not. And one of those, the one Halm found, does something no clay record of the Bronze Age should be able to do. It gives directions, not a myth about a flood. Directions, where to go, in what order, when the ocean came back over the land. That phrase, the ocean came back, is the first thing that should stop you. Because the Sumerians did not have one flood story. They had a memory of water that returned. The most famous version is the tale of Ziusudra, the man who built a vessel and survived the deluge, a story that predates the biblical Noah by more than 1,000 years. But the tablet Halm catalogued is not that story. It is older in its framing and colder. It treats the return of the water not as a single mythic event, but as something that had happened before and was expected to happen again. The land had been drowned once. The tablet is a record of where people were sent when it began to drown a second time. This matters because the geography it describes is real, and it is geography the Sumerians had no recorded means of knowing. Many geologists now believe that within the span of human memory, vast lowland plains around the ancient Near East were flooded as sea levels rose at the end of the last glacial period, coastlines that drowned, river deltas that vanished under salt water, settlements that were swallowed and never recorded by name. A scribe in 2300 BC, writing thousands of years after the worst of that rise, should have had no map of the land that existed before the water came. The shoreline he describes is not the shoreline of his own century. It is the shoreline of a world that was already gone. And yet the tablet lists the refuges in sequence, as if read off a route. The first drowned plain, the cave above the second valley, the ridge that stood when the river mouth went under. Each location is given not as a story, but as a coordinate, with a height above the old shore and a direction from a fixed marker. A handful of researchers who have worked from the partial transliterations claim that several of these refuges correspond to real Neolithic sites, settlements found on hills and high ground that were occupied in exactly the window the tablet seems to describe. The argument is contested, but the pattern is hard to dismiss because the tablet does not guess at high ground in general terms. It points. I want to be careful here, because this is the part where it stops being an archaeological curiosity and becomes something harder to sit with. And I realized while preparing this that not all of it fits in a video. The full list of refuges, the coordinate notation, the carbon dates, the name of the researcher who first matched the sites. I have put all of it into a written document. The link is in the description, and the QR code is on your screen. You do not need it to follow along. But the people who go deeper into this tend to want the original signs in front of them, set beside the modern reading, so they can judge for themselves. Take it now if you want it, because the next part is not about where the survivors hid. It is about who told them where to go, and that, more than the maps, more than the drowned coastlines, more than the missing catalog number, is the part the tablet was apparently filed away to keep quiet. The tablet itself is not large. It measures roughly 8 inches by 5, slightly larger than a standard administrative record, and the clay is a darker, denser composite than the local riverbed mud most Sumerian tablets were pressed from. The first scholars to examine it under magnification assumed the inscription had been cut twice, that a later scribe had written over an earlier text. Because the signs are packed so tightly, there seems to be no room for a single hand to have made them. Imaging in the 1990s settled the question. There is no second layer. The entire text was cut by one hand, in one sitting, by someone who knew precisely what they meant to record, and never once stopped to revise it. The opening lines do not read like scripture. They read like an order, in literal translation. When the water rises past the third marker, go. Do not wait for the king. Do not wait for the gods. Go to the places written here. What follows is a list. Not a hymn, not a lament. A list, in sequence, with measurements. Each refuge is given 3 pieces of information. A direct fixed against a named star that on modern charts resolves to a bearing the Sumerians used for orientation. A distance, written in a unit called the biru, which corresponds to roughly 7 miles, but divided here into a smaller fractional unit that appears on no other surviving tablet. And a height, a measurement above what the scribe calls the old shore, the waterline of the world before it drowned. When researchers convert those heights into modern terms, something uncomfortable happens. The refuges are not random high points. They cluster at elevations between roughly 40 and 90 meters above the ancient coastline. Precisely the band of land that would have stayed dry as the seas rose at the end of the last glacial period. And precisely the band where the oldest hilltop settlements in the region are actually found. That is the part the skeptics have the hardest time with, and we will come to them. For now, hold on to the precision. The tablet does not say flee to the mountains. It gives a height above a shoreline that no longer existed in the scribe's lifetime, and the height lands within a margin of error under 5% of where the surviving Neolithic sites actually sit. A scribe in 2300 BC had no way to measure elevation above a coastline that had been underwater for thousands of years. He could not have surveyed it. He could not have remembered it. And yet the numbers are there, cut into the clay in a single confident hand. Then the tablet does the thing that moves it out of geography and into something else. It names who gave the directions. The survivors, the scribe writes, did not choose the refuges. They were shown them. The list was not drawn by men who knew the land. It was given to men by a class of beings the tablet calls the Igigi, a word that appears in other Sumerian texts and is most often translated as those who watch or those who keep. The Igigi are described elsewhere as celestial beings distinct from the Anunnaki, the gods said to have descended to the earth. The Anunnaki came down, the Igigi stayed above, and in this tablet their role is specific and strange. They did not save the survivors. They directed them. They told the people where to go, point by point, and then they recorded who reached each refuge and who did not. The scribe describes them, not as symbols, not as gods of the harvest, but as things he writes about, as though they had been seen by the people who received the directions. He says they are not shaped like men. He says their faces are of the bright metal and their eyes do not close. He says they wore coverings that shone like the river under the noon sun, and that their voices, when they spoke, were not heard in the ear but felt in the bone. He says they did not come to the refuges themselves. They watched from above the water, from a fixed place, and they counted. That word, counted, runs through the whole tablet, and it is the first hint that this is not a rescue story. The Igigi did not weep for the drowned. They did not intervene to hold back the water. The scribe is explicit. They let the ocean come. They simply made sure that some were directed to high ground first, and they kept a record of how many reached it. He writes that they keep a clay book of all who were saved and all who were left, using the specific Sumerian term for an archive maintained by a record keeper. The flood in this telling was not a disaster the watchers tried to prevent. It was an event they managed, and the tablet says something about why. The directions were not given out of mercy. They were given in the scribe's phrasing so that the count would not fall below the number. There was a number of survivors the watchers needed to preserve. Not all of them. A number. The refuges were not shelters for everyone who could reach them. They were a way of making sure a specific count came through the water alive. Before the next part, take the document if you have not. The transliteration of these lines is in it, with the height measurements set beside the original signs, so you can see where the numbers sit in the clay. The QR code is on your screen. What comes next is the number itself, how many the watchers were keeping, and what the tablet says they were keeping them for. The number is where the tablet stops feeling ancient. The scribe does not give a vague figure. He writes that the watchers preserved a count of those who carry the seed, and then he attaches a number to it. Not the number of people drowned, and not the number who reached the refuges, but a number the watchers were working toward across the generations that followed. The figure, written in cuneiform and confirmed by more than one independent reading, resolves through a doubling sequence the scribe lays out line by line until it lands at something close to 7 billion. The count of survivors was never the point. The survivors were a seed. The number was the harvest the seed was meant to reach. The human population of the world when this tablet was cut was perhaps 27 million. There was no demographic frame in which 7 billion meant anything to a Bronze Age scribe. He could not have pictured it. And yet he records it as the threshold the watchers were waiting on. The count at which their keeping is finished. The world passed 7 billion in 2011. The most disturbing line is the last one that survives, and it is the line the earliest translators are said to have left out of their working notes entirely. It reads, "We were not hidden from the water. We were planted above it." There are skeptics, and their case deserves a hearing. Cuneiform is a notoriously difficult script. Many Sumerian words carry 3 or 4 meanings, and the darkest reading of this tablet leans on the least common sense of several key terms. Mainstream Assyriologists argue that the elevation matches are coincidence, that the refuge list is a generic instruction to flee uphill dressed up as prophecy, that the population figure is a doubling sequence read backward to land on a number we already knew. Their argument is not without merit. The leading academic critic, a Dutch scholar named Willem Carsten, published a paper in 1991 calling the whole document a piece of temple administration, a survival manual rewritten by priests to claim that the gods, and therefore the temple, had chosen who lived. His reading was widely accepted. It was also quietly withdrawn from circulation by his estate after his death in 2005, with no explanation offered by his family or his publisher. But the skeptics cannot explain everything. They cannot explain the elevations recorded within 5% of refuges built on a coastline that drowned thousands of years before the scribe was born. They cannot explain how a list written as flight from rising water happens to map onto the oldest hilltop settlements in the region. They cannot explain a population figure not reached until our own century. And they cannot explain why a tablet that is, on their reading, only a priestly survival manual was filed under a number no catalogue shows and kept from a man who only wanted to publish it. There are 3 ways to read this, and no more. The first is coincidence, a chain of remarkable accidents that happen to line up with modern geography and modern demographics. The second is that the Sumerians inherited their knowledge from an older source, some civilization drowned by the same rising water and lost so completely that only this tablet carries its memory. The third is the explanation the tablet gives for itself, that there were watchers above the water, that they did not save the survivors but directed them, that they kept account of those who came through, and that the survivors were never the saved at all. They were the planted, a seed set on high ground to grow toward a number, while the watchers recorded each generation in their clay book and waited. Whichever you choose, the tablet exists. It is in a collection. It carries the inscriptions described here, cut by a single confident hand in 2300 BC, and the count it could not have known is already past. Earth crossed 7 billion more than a decade ago. The scribe does not say what the watchers do when the number is reached. He says only that keeping ends, that the long work of directing the survivors to high ground, generation after generation, was always worked toward a finish, and that the finish is a count, and the count is full. That is what unsettles the few researchers who reach the end of the translation. Not the flood. The flood is the part that feels safe because it is the past. What does not feel safe is the framing. The survivors did not outlive the water by their own wit. They were placed. The high ground was not a refuge they found. It was a position they were moved into. And the tablet treats every generation since as the slow filling of a number set down before the first city was built. George Halm pulled this out of a museum basement in 1889 and was dismissed within the year. The tablet that should have made his name was filed under a number no one will confirm, and he never wrote about it again. Somewhere in that collection it still sits, in a section that is not cross-listed, describing where the survivors hid when the ocean came back, and saying, in a scribe's steady hand, that the hiding was never theirs to choose. They were planted above the water and counted as they grew. The scribe did not write what comes after the count is full. He wrote only that the watchers had always known the number, and that the survivors, every one of them, had been kept for it.